Hello, PAX people. I'm Will Shick, head of studio for Atomic Mass Games. I'm here with our lead developer, William Pagani. We're here to talk about design and development in tabletop games, overall philosophies, and then how that applies to the games that we make. Say hello, Pagani.
Hello, Pagani.
There we
I,
go.
I had to, right?
You had to,
Sorry.
yeah, it's just too
I started
perfect.
this out on
All right, so just really
we'll
quick to
fill
kind
it.
of give you an overview of what we do. We're a tabletop game studio that makes hobby miniatures games. If you don't know what a hobby miniatures game is, just in a general overview, these are games in which you, as the player, collect miniatures. You get to assemble, paint, and then play games with them on a tabletop. Most hobby miniatures games really look to emulate some kind of simulation on the tabletop in terms of combat, because you're working with three-dimensional elements, you have terrain, and everything that gets set up. So with our game, Marvel Crisis Protocol, it's set in the Marvel Universe, and it seeks to kind of reenact the greatest battles of the Marvel Universe. So you get to sit down with your opponents and tell a story, your own Marvel story, using your characters and kind of throwing cards at your other characters, battling out over various mission objectives and trying to complete your goals before your opponent can complete theirs. The big thing with hobby miniatures games, of course, is the level of detail and complexity that you can get into. They range the gamut from all kinds of different steps. With ours, of course, we're really trying to emphasize the big, exciting moments that we all have come to love from Marvel over the last several decades of Marvel comics, and then the last decade of Marvel movies, of course, as well, and Marvel media. And so this presents an interesting challenge in how you approach things. And we kind of want to give you an insight into how we've come up through the gaming industry and through the different games that we've played, how we've kind of brought all this together to create a game that we feel really encapsulates the Marvel IP feel and the excitement that we want to generate from playing games with each other and telling the stories that evolve around these games. So, Pagani, why don't you go ahead and just give a little background about yourself?
Uh, sure. Yeah, I've been playing tabletop games since I was very young. Um, Playing all sorts of different ones. I don't know, countless ones. I've played in tournaments. I've played casually. I've actually run a game store. So I've done all sorts of things inside of the gaming industry, and stumbled my way into Atomic Mass Games as my most recent adventure, and quite an adventure it is, and it's been fantastic getting to work with you and create Marvel Crisis Protocol.
Yeah, and so I had a similar track record. I worked in the hobby industry in stores. I started miniatures gaming when I was really young. I actually came into miniatures gaming actually through hobby modeling. So building, model airplanes and model cars and things like that with my dad. The building aspect really appealed to me when I found out that there were ways to take those models and turn them into miniatures in a game and to actually play games with them. So I was a really big board gamer. We did a lot of tabletop gaming in my family with my friends. It was kind of just the thing we did. So being able to combine the two to me was really exciting, and it kind of led on this journey that eventually wound up with me being at Atomic Mass, with a lot of folks that I'd worked with in the industry that have just been a joy to kind of put our mark on this product and to be able to work in Marvel, which I've been a huge fan of since I was 6 years old. My mom bought me a Spider-Man comic and said, "You might like this." Little did she know what that would cause. So it's kind of a combination of two different passions for me, and it's super exciting to be able to work on this and to kind of like get to put our mark in the world. And I think for me, talking about design philosophies and just in general, what I'm looking for when I approach any game, whether I'm playing it or whether it's my job to try to bring it to actuality on a tabletop with a great team like we have at Atomic Mass. The end of the day, the reason that I keep coming back to games is because of the social shared experience. And one of the things that we kind of have as our pillar at the studio is the idea that games are meant to create fun experiences together. And so for me, like one of the things I always look at whenever we're talking about something for any game that we're making, and especially Marvel Crisis Protocol, is how are we achieving that goal? Like, is this experience going to bring people together in a way that you can't get from a lot of other mediums? In that very direct social way where we're going to create an experience that we're going to remember and we're going to have stories about. And to me, that's the core fundamental like difference between a good game and a bad game when it comes to tabletop. Is does the game bring you together? And it can bring you together in a lot of different ways. Pagani, you mentioned that you've like basically played games competitively as a professional, all the way to playing as a casual kind of like I'm just here to enjoy this. And I think like everything has its merits. But at the end of the analysis, it's what is that experience that it's going to be? Because in the end, there's a lot of different ways to spend people's time, to enjoy the things that you want to do, and I think the thing that makes tabletop stand out and so appealing and have such a broad like draw to people, especially in the last 10 years, when you have so many different forms of expression, it is at the core that idea that it unifies us in a very immediate and visceral way. And so that's kind of like the when I dive really deep, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to achieve that goal in whatever we're doing. And then you get to the next layers and it's like, well, how are we doing that? Well, we're having, dudes in leotards throw things at each other. That's pretty cool, right?
I mean,
So,
it's something unique and exciting, our genre that we have worked with here. To touch a little bit on what you said, and I think this is the most important thing for us is always player experience,
mhm.
and kind of to talk about that a little bit more, right? When a player comes to a table to play a game or play a video game or play a board game or a miniatures game, like whatever kind of game you're going to play, uh, that experience is something that is always at our like always at the very front of everything that we do at Atomic Mass Games, because if you're not enjoying yourself, if you're not having fun, if you don't like the characters you're working with, or you don't like the things that are happening around you, you're not going to have a great time, and that's going to cause a rift between you and your opponent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you and the other players in your game if you're playing a cooperative game. So everything that we do at Atomic Mass Games is always focused around player experience and
Mm-hmm.
community and bringing people together and that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a lot about player experience going through how we designed Crisis Protocol, how we design characters in Crisis Protocol,
Mm-hmm.
how we design rules, and all of that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And
So
so,
that's absolutely our biggest sort of design pillar is making sure that people are having fun, making sure that people are enjoying themselves,
yeah.
making sure that everyone gets to do the cool thing, I
Yeah,
guess.
and I think like for me, the other thing too when it comes down to and this is kind of like very large scope, what does it mean to us when we're designing games, right? There are a lot of different ways to approach it. You can look at it from a, well, I'm looking to create a really cerebral experience that somebody is going to be able to deep dive into, get really crunchy with and enjoy. And there's definitely going to be a segment of players who are going to gravitate towards that. And they're not going to be as worried as other people might be about having that social connection, having that player experience of enjoyment and kind of the exciting and fun. So there's like our way is not necessarily the only way, but this is how we've kind of come to over the years in working with games and exploring games, like what we feel is best and what we really want to do. And I think at the end of the day, there's something to be said for like our way is developed a lot from what we want as players, what we found
Absolutely.
enjoyable, what we think is really cool. And to that end, the another one of like the core concepts, like you said, is that idea of fun, that idea of great moments, of narrative, of storytelling that happens in the game.
Hmm.
And for me, that's one of like the core concepts. Like I don't mind, and I actually enjoy the gamble. I enjoy randomness, to a certain extent. Like I like to have control, but the most exciting and the most memorable things out of games for me are the unexpected, the times where you roll dice and you get a completely different result than what you expected, and the story that comes out of that, out of those great successes or those great failures, right? When things go as according to plan, to me that is less memorable. It inspires less fun. Humor and laughter are really compelling, and I think the way you get most humor, is when something that you didn't expect happen, right? That's what makes us break out in laughter, makes us gasp. It creates an emotional response. And so I think this is part of our yin and yang in terms of what I look for more in a game than what perhaps you are looking for based on the professional experience, of playing these games competitively. Is I find that I enjoy a higher level of random chance of risk versus reward, in the games that I play. And I think I've injected a lot of that in terms of design and my philosophy onto Crisis Protocol, where you I think have a slightly different take, and that's where we kind of start to get our really fantastic mix.
Yeah, and I think it's games designed for different communities, right? Have different sort of focus points. And I think we've done a great job with Crisis Protocol, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how we've done this in finding an excellent balance sort of between the highly random, very unpredictable, very crazy style gameplay that you love, and in the very like meticulous and planned out phases and things like that that I love. Not that I don't love the other one or you don't love what I love as well, but each person as a player has something they're looking for in every game that they play, and casting a very wide net in game design, I think, is very important in the industry right now, and I think it's something that we've done a phenomenal job with in Crisis Protocol.
Yeah,
So,
and it's one of those things where again, I think success or failure for us is really based on the idea of can somebody come to Crisis Protocol or any game that you have a hand in, and for me, it's do they walk away having had an enjoyable time. We don't
absolutely,
want people walking away feeling frustrated or having a less than experience. And a lot of that also comes back to kind of diving down now and getting into the roots. So we've talked about general like grand design philosophy when it comes to games and what we're looking for and trying to accomplish. And then how do you start to step into that accomplishment? And I think step one is to really understand that from our viewpoint, player experience means having the most comprehensive, cleanest, and understandable rule set. Whereas I do enjoy a lot of randomness and unexpectedness in the actual gameplay, I don't want that out of like learning to play the game or the overall rules mechanics of the game. I don't want to have to have a lot of discussion or have a lot of confusion or a lot of interpretation, let's say, about rules. And in some ways, this puts me at odds with certain games. For example, I don't particularly enjoy games that are more free-form, story-driven experiences. So I've never really resonated a lot with RPGs, whereas a lot of people on our team have. And part of that reason is because I kind of want a solid roadmap. I don't want to have to role play my way through it. I don't want to have to go through the creation process myself. For many, that's really enjoyable, and I think in certain games it works. When it comes to the complexity and kind of the crunchiness that you need from a miniatures game because of what it's trying to accomplish in terms of being a simulation on a three-dimensional tabletop of whatever narrative or story or theme you're telling. In our case, big battles between superpowered, beings. You have to kind of narrow that in, right? In order to achieve what the game overall and what the audience really wants. And so that I think comes back to kind of how we've approached everything in terms of making sure that we have timing charts and we have these things that to you I know are really important in terms of making a great game experience and have been an invaluable contribution that you've made to the thing. So go ahead and just kind of talk about kind of how that nitty gritty works and the reasons why we look at it that way.
yeah. So having uh, things like standardized rules language in games is very important to me because then as a player I can understand like, well, it says this, so this is how it happens, and that to me is great for a lot of different reasons. And there's more things than just standardized rules language that I'll go over here, but allowing players to play the game without confusion or without having to look anything up or look up a rule because they understand and it was clearly explained to them during their demo game, during the time they read the rule book, during whatever it is that they want to do, is excellent because it whereas they may not be telling a story like they would in an RPG, right? Where it's I went into the tavern and I did these things and that kind of stuff, right? But they are telling a story with their game, and being able to stay inside of that headspace where they're in the game allows them to do that, right? If they don't have any rules questions, if they don't have any arguments with their opponent about what something does or what something is, that really is one of our primary goals, or one of the primary goals of my job as a developer, right, is to make sure that everyone understands what's happening the first time they read a rule. And we don't always get it right. There are certainly some confusions, but that's the goal. And if there is any confusion, being able to answer that question with reference. You had mentioned timing charts. For the vast majority of players, they'll never use a timing chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'll be like, cool, I made an attack here. I roll these dice. Some stuff happens. That's great. But some players do want to know, well, at step 2B, then this happens, and blah blah blah. Like, and that's important to be able to support those players as well, right? Because once again, we talked about casting a wide net in gaming and getting as many people as we can into the game. Uh, that timing chart doesn't hurt anyone in any way, and it only helps the people that care about it. Uh, so, sort of clarity of rules, explanation inside of rules, and precision is, in my opinion, one of the very important things about game design and game development.
Well, and there's an interesting like kind of it's a bit of the alchemist like grand journey for a game developer is the limitation of language. You can only explain things within the boundaries of whatever the language provides you. And this is kind of always the challenge, right? So we talk about chiming charts, you talk about clear rules, you talk about how we don't always get it right. And the fact is that, you know, this is kind of like the grand struggle is that there is no way to explain something to everyone in a way that they're always going to understand. And even when something is clear to you, it can be misinterpreted by others. And so this is kind of the constant work of the design and the development of any tabletop game or any living game system is how do you kind of bridge that gap knowing that it's an impossible one to completely bridge. You know, because there are a lot of people out there who really want rules to tell them exactly what they can't do. And if you tried to go through and list everything in a game that you can't do so that you can understand what you can do, you know, it's going to be a phone book size of, like, it's just going to be a phone book of rules. So instead, you know, good design and game development, in my opinion, and I think vastly if you look at all of the examples out there in the industry, the rules tell you what you can do, which leaves interpretation sometimes to, well, they don't say I can't do this, you know, and that's I think where you start to have these little like foibles and hiccups when you're trying to design and develop really consolidated and concise rules. And again, it's something that the limitation of language, like we talk about, it leads to that kind of stuff. And so being mindful of that and trying to provide a lot of different resources and attributes to clearly explain what you can do to players is a really important thing as well when you're exploring this stuff. The next thing that we kind of talk about, and this kind of just walks down the path, right? And all of this is going to lead into kind of how we explain how all of these things applied to Crisis Protocol, which is the game that we designed, is complexity budget. So this is one that is really important to me from the aspect of I like a lot of different games. My house is filled with board games, miniatures games, just like yours is, right? And
Yeah.
to bucket yourself into a single bracket of I only like this type of game. There are some people who have like one flavor they really love and that's all they're interested in. But I think generally most people have this wide range of things, you know, just like with food, you don't always want Mexican. Sometimes you do want Italian. Sometimes you want to go out and you want to eat some good pho, or have some Vietnamese, right? Like there's all kinds of different times when you have this feeling, and complexity budget plays into that. So, you know, not only when you're talking about the appeal of a game, you know, if you're an aspiring game developer or designer out there, the first thing I would urge you to do with whatever you're doing is determine what your complexity budget is. Who are you trying to reach? Are you trying to create a true simulation that crunches all the numbers and it takes into account everything? Are you looking at, you know, three-dimensional vertices and volumes and all of this stuff? And know that your complexity budget has to be really high for that. And because the complexity budget's high, it's going to be very difficult for players to understand. Your rules language is going to have to be really dense and complex because you're trying to deal with a lot of different variables. And that's fine. You can have, you know, there's no complexity bank. You can have a budget however you want. But I would urge almost everybody to take into account, like, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. And knowing
Sure.
what your complexity budget is, and then having, you know, that set from the start is really going to help you, because what it's going to force you to do as you move along through the design and development process is it's going to force you to strongly evaluate every choice that you make. Because when you're developing a game, there really are no bounds, especially in tabletop. You know, we don't have we really don't have system or computing like limitations that will stop us from being able to design the most crazy thing imaginable. We have the human brain, which is kind of the computation device that we're working with. We're inputting data so that your brain can figure it out. But the brain is pretty smart, and there's a lot of people out there who have really, really smart brains. So there's always going to be an audience, right? That said, there is such a thing as information overload, which I know you're going to talk about a little bit as well. But know your complexity budget, and then from there, make sure that you don't go into complexity debt. And what that means is once you've decided, okay, I want a game that's going to be playable by, intermediate players. I want it to have a really broad appeal. I want to have it played in 90 minutes. I want it to, take into account the fact that there are going to be people who have never played this style of game before, like Crisis Protocol. That was one of our goals. We knew that Marvel was going to appeal to people, and we wanted to be a place where people could get brought in and have their first miniatures game experience and have really a lot of fun with these iconic characters that they want to represent on the tabletop. And from there, stick to that budget. Make sure that you're not adding things, or when you see yourself going over the budget, you start to cut back, evaluate what's really important to get the game experience that you want. And if you know that up front, it's going to make a huge impact on the final game product that you have and the rules that you have in terms of achieving those goals that you set out for yourself. And it's a lot like it's discipline. It's just like anything else in life. You have to make sure that you're disciplined enough to stay the course, and always understand too that just because you come up with the best idea ever, and you think it's just great, but it doesn't fit your complexity budget, no one's ever going to know that it's not there. And that's another really big thing too.
That's always the hardest parts for me working, right? Is like we have this great idea and I really want it to work so bad, but it takes too much language, it takes too many components, it takes too many of these things. And I'm like, oh god, but it would be so cool. And then we have to scrap it because it doesn't work. Because you can't do it, right? Like our game's not designed for it. But knowing when you have to do that and being able to do that, I think is a very important part of game development and sort of staying on target, I guess, as you said.
Yeah. So walk us through cognitive load and how it impacts your decisions as you're going through development and stuff, because I know it's one that you're really watching for.
Yeah, so cognitive load is the idea that a human person can only remember so many things at one time. Essentially, think of it as the maximum number of variables a human being can use at a time, essentially. So whenever we are designing characters or designing a game or things like that, we always think about cognitive load, and that really plays into complexity budget and like target audiences, right? So in Crisis Protocol, we have dice, obviously are our randomizing thing, and they have a bunch of symbols on them. So the symbols, there's 5 different symbols on the dice. That's a relatively large amount of cognitive load. So what we then did with that was, cool, well, you just roll 5 dice and they roll 5 dice, and then you just compare the symbols and that's your attack. So our attack sequence is very simple, but the dice are relatively complex, and that gives you some interesting things there. What you wouldn't want to do is like have, cool, well, the wind is blowing from the north and my character has to be more than 8 inches away, and I have to roll 8 dice, and then they have a different type of dice that they roll, and they have to roll 6 of those, but there's a car in the way. So you don't want to add all these variables to the game if you're going for a relatively low complexity budget, which is what we have done with Crisis Protocol. Or I guess a mid-level complexity budget is what we did here. Because that is too much for a player to think about. And cognitive load issues can cause a lot of problems in tabletop gaming. It can cause one of my personal favorite phrases, which is analysis paralysis, which is a player is given too many options and they can't pick one, so they just kind of sit there and stare at the table. And I'm pretty guilty of that when I'm playing like new board games that I haven't played before. I'm like, I have to make the perfect move. What do I do? So I'm always looking for situations like that whenever we're looking at characters or new Crisis or Ultimate Encounters or anything like that for Crisis Protocol, because we want the game to keep moving, right? We talked about how we want to clean clear and concise rules so that you get to stay inside the game. If players are stopping to think for 15, 20, 30 minutes at a time, that's not going to work out if our ideal game time is 90 minutes. So
Mm-hmm.
cognitive load is something that we're always looking at. How many variables are happening? How many things do I have to remember at once? Does this character give a buff effect to another character if they're within a certain range? How many of those are there on the table? Are there 5? That's probably too many. Is there 1? That's probably okay. Is it an iconic ability, or is it just like a tack-on ability?
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things are relevant when we're discussing characters and game concepts and all the things like that in Crisis Protocol, uh, because the player experience is so important. We don't want you to have to really go down the rabbit hole, is kind of what I always called it, or into the tank was another common phrase. The think tank is what that phrase is referring to. Uh, to figure out your next move, right? We want you to be like, oh, I'm a superhero. I'm going to throw this car at this guy. That's great. I don't have to think about this. Let's throw the car. So that's sort of always something that we're looking at when designing Crisis Protocol. Is are we hitting that budget? Is it too much? Is it too little? And we look at that a lot through playtester feedback, which is, oh, I just completely forgot this ability existed during my games. Like, cool. Well, we probably don't need that ability, because if they're not thinking about it, they don't care about it, they don't want it to work, and it's too much cognitive load.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's
so,
a big part of game development for me.
mm-hmm. So kind of taking these general concepts now that we've talked about and distilling them down to kind of show our application of how these initial like grand ideas work within the game that we've designed. You know, the goals of MCP, or Marvel Crisis Protocol, I'll probably shorthanded MCP from time to time because it's what we do in the office all the time. It's just quicker. We have so many things happening at the speed of sound.
A long name.
Yeah, it's a lot of typing. But so we were given a chance to design a tabletop miniatures game within the Marvel universe. Super exciting. A lot of different ways you could go with it. You know, the Marvel universe is vast and epic and awesome, and there's really no wrong way to start. So the first step was to figure out, okay, what do we want the game experience to be like? And, you know, from my vantage point, I think the thing that is most exciting about the Marvel IP, of course, is the characters. You know, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Red Skull, Punisher, Nebula, Thanos. These characters that have like transcended kind of modern mythology and that resonate with people for different reasons, that have these great stories around them. That to me is really the DNA of what makes great Marvel. It's not, you know, a ton of Shield agents and Hydra guys squaring off on battle and being led by these heroes. It's literally just these characters grouping together and doing amazing and awesome things on a battlefield, throwing trucks and cars, hypersonic punching each other, shooting laser blasts at each other, you know, repulsor beams, all kinds of stuff, right? So, you know, very quickly it was like, okay, we now have the game. To me, we had the game design. You know, I knew what game I wanted to design, which was a small level skirmish game where we could really focus in on these characters. We could give them the limelight and allow, again, taking into account cognitive load. If you're going to have these characters and you're going to make them really robust and have a lot of abilities and rules to really reflect the powers they have in the comics, you can't have a lot of other stuff, right? And you can't have a lot of them on the table. If each character has 12 different things going on and you multiply that by 20, we're too far. We've clearly broken the brain's ability to track all this. But if you have, you know, 6 to 12 things depending on character, and then that means you have 3 to 5 characters per, you know, squad, and that's all you're tracking, maybe with your opponent's stuff a little bit too, we're talking about slightly more reasonable cognitive load. And then of course, how complex are those rules and things. So by immediately narrowing down to that small skirmish scale, like we're going to have about 5 heroes or villains per side in a squad, now we can get really, you know, we can really deep dive into these characters, which to me felt like the right move. It was really important. Like I wanted to see these characters shine on the tabletop. I wanted to feel like I was commanding or controlling Iron Man as I did my little pew pew noises and rolled my dice. I wanted to feel like Hulk as I smashed a building on top of my opponent's, you know, miniature. So that was number one. That now we know, okay, we're going to have very small squads on the tabletop. This is going to allow us to really dive into those characters. Another really big one to me right away was I wanted the terrain to have an impact on the game beyond just being set dressing. So if you've never played a hobby miniatures game before, you play these games with miniatures, like three-dimensional representations of your troops, of your characters, and you play it on a three-dimensional tabletop that uses terrain, that uses 3D elements to set the stage. Now these are really important in terms of developing line of sight, because all miniatures games kind of take the idea that the miniature is in this environment. So there's a lot of different ways to assume how they see across buildings, how they see each other, all of that stuff. But that's where terrain kind of ends. It just becomes a thing that gets in your way and then looks really cool as you tell your story on the tabletop over your battle. I can't imagine a Marvel comic book or a fight scene or any kind of Marvel anything without the Hulk literally picking up a truck and throwing it at somebody, without somebody going careening into a car and having it explode. This is the Marvel battle. Like, this is superhero combat. So it became really important that now the terrain becomes more than just set dressing. It becomes an actual thing that players can interact with, their characters can throw, crash into, destroy, all this stuff. And then the other really big point for me was that we had a true narrative to the game, that the game was focused on players coming together to have a big superhero fight and have fun doing that, but also to tell their own comic story, to tell a Marvel story that felt like it fit within the universe with these amazing characters. If we're going to take all this time and this effort and this energy to translate the characters from the page to the tabletop, well, the reason we're doing that is so that you and your friends can come together and tell your own Marvel story and walk away from the table with that story, with that shared experience. Again, we're going back to, like, what is the greatest reason for games existing? And from our studio perspective, it's that they bring people together through this shared experience told on the tabletop. So we knew that narrative was going to be really important. This wasn't just pure combat. There was going to be story behind it. There were going to be reasons that these characters were coming together. We were going to give the prompts to you effectively, to use kind of an author term. You were going to get prompted by the game itself, and then you were going to construct the story through your actions, through your dice rolls, through just your interactions with your opponent, and the stories that you told around what happened on the tabletop. And that became kind of our core pillar concepts of what Marvel Crisis Protocol needed to be as we dove into the development.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. Taking those ideas and turning it into a game was very exciting. We very quickly realized that we wanted an alternating activation game rather than an I go, you go game. So what that means is I will activate a single character, then my opponent will activate a single character, and we'll go back and forth until everyone has activated all of their characters, or some other thing will end the round. But this did a couple things for the game. It created a sense of involvement constantly in the game, right? You're not waiting for your opponent to finish this 10 or 15 minute long turn. You're waiting to see what they're going to do with this specific character, and turns are very, very quick in Crisis Protocol. Sometimes 5 seconds or less for an activation, sometimes a minute or two. But having that very fast back and forth keeps players engaged and keeps it exciting and interesting.
And we added an extra layer to that too, in that we have a system where every character has superpowers. This effectively is like their abilities that represent their powers. And some of those abilities can be used reactively. So they're not used on your turn, they're used on your opponent's turn when triggering events happen. So that also gives you a chance to kind of, play at the same time as your opponent when they trigger those abilities. And I think that's another thing with the alternating activation system that really means that there's never a dull moment on a Crisis Protocol battlefield. Like, you're engaged the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. So keeping that very engaged, focused style of gameplay was very important for Crisis Protocol. And then, of course, really pushing the narrative and not our narrative, right? It's always very important that when you're playing Crisis Protocol, you get to play your narrative. So when we're looking at army construction or squad construction or roster construction, whichever one you want to, whatever word you want to use for tabletop gaming, list building, I guess, is another one. We wanted to keep it very open, right? So our system that we came up with is a roster system. You get to pick 10 characters. Any 10 characters you want. You can play good guys, you can play bad guys, you can play questionable guys, like whatever you want to do, you can put them in your roster. And they can all play together. So you can have Red Skull hanging out with Captain America and their buddies, at least for this fight. Because there's always these huge Marvel team ups. So that was a really important thing for us. And then, of course, telling your story, right? Maybe Cap's been mind controlled. Maybe Red Skull has been, I don't know, he's working for S.H.I.E.L.D. for some reason because there's a bigger threat or something. I don't know. Whatever narrative you want to come up with, that's great. And you're going to be able to tell that in Crisis Protocol. We're not going to restrict you at all in what you can or can't do with your characters. We also, to build upon that narrative, have what are called tactic cards, which are purely narratively focused things that you can do in the game. So think things like bounce a repulsor blast from Iron Man off Captain America's shield, or Thor throws Loki at someone. All of these are tactic cards that you can do that we give you the option to include inside of your roster. And then we have crisis cards, which are also part of your roster. Those are the objectives that you're fighting over. You get to pick those, and both players will pick those every game. It's not a single objective that everyone is trying to do. You have two objectives in every game, and in every game, you pair two different cards together to create your story, your objectives, what your characters are trying to do. You get to influence half of it, your opponent gets to influence half of it. And what that does is that creates a very fluid system where kind of there is no best character, right? Because you don't know what crisis you're going to play. You don't know what they're going to bring. There is no perfect list or perfect army, anything, because there's too much variability between each game, too much replayability inside of each thing that whoever is good in one situation may not be good in another situation. And that was always really important for us because, I mean, I don't know about you, Shick, but I always get annoyed when games are solved. And they're like, well, this is the list, you play this, and that's it.
Yeah,
so
I
think
it's always
definitely something that I wanted to try to
solved
avoid.
in quotes too.
It's
Well, and I
always
think
in
the other
quotes,
thing,
because it's
the other
never
thing
actually
too,
solved. But
yeah,
yeah.
and the other thing too, coming from it as a fan of the Marvel comics and somebody who, has loved these characters forever. We talk about this too. Like every character out there, regardless of your personal feelings on the character, right? We all have our favorites, and we all have the ones that we roll our eyes at because there's so many characters in the Marvel universe, and they're just ones that resonate and don't. Every character is somebody's favorite, and the last thing that I ever want as a steward now of this little segment of the Marvel universe is to have somebody be like, well, I can never play my favorite character because they exist in the game, right? We haven't gotten everybody yet. We're maybe one day, that's the goal, right? but if their favorite character exists, like the last thing I ever want, the only real way that I'll consider our endeavor a failure is if they go, but I can't play that character because they just don't work. They're not right. So a lot of that too comes not just from the idea of solving the game, but also from making sure that every character who's somebody's favorite has reason to be there, has viability, has a chance to be amazing. And the other thing that we determined at the start through kind of things is how characters use their ability. And I think this is one that's really good to kind of dive into too, is player choice. So giving players option. You talked a lot about how we want you to tell your story. Well, that goes beyond just an idea of setting up the game and playing through the game. It's also giving players agency throughout the entire game process. So we do that through a system called Power. Effectively, if you've ever read or watched a Marvel story, you know that the characters never start with their A-list ability, right? There's always some there's some rope-a-dope, there's some punches, and things escalate because that's good storytelling. Narratively, it's not fun if somebody just starts with their big explosion, their big super move that their win all game, and it's okay, well now what are we going to do for the next 12 pages, or what are we going to do for the next 5 issues, right? It's already solved. So again, diving back into that idea that this game needs to be narrative, it needs to be true to the IP. You want that buildup. You want to watch as these characters accumulate power and they begin to ramp up and they take big hits and then they hit back really hard. And you want to give players the option and the choice to be able to choose how those things occur. And the power system is how we did that. So not only does the power system allow characters to kind of come back stronger after taking like a pounding. So if they get beat up, it doesn't feel as bad because now they have all of this resource that they can then use and spend on all of their cool abilities to have a really explosive and exciting turn. And how you as a player manage that resource for each of your characters, what you decide to spend it on, really changes and like develops your own personal tactics and touch. And of course, all transfers back into the story of what's happening between these characters on the tabletop. And so that idea of player choice is another one that's really important, I think, overall to the idea of fun, to that player experience. So go ahead and kind of dive in and let me know, or let us know a little bit about, developing around player choice and the things you're looking for as you do that.
Yeah, so as characters gain power, as their resource, they have to spend it on things. So we always have unique ways for characters to gain power. That can be through attacking, that can be through taking damage, as Shick said earlier. That could be through meditating, right? We just released a Wong who has an ability to meditate where he can just spend actions to gain power because that's something that that character does a lot, right? So we always want interesting and different ways for characters to gain power. And then, of course, we want different ways for them to spend it as well. Whether that be attacks, like Iron Man can shoot homing rockets, and that costs him power, or he can use his unibeam if he's been injured. We also have a injured mechanic, which is certainly something to talk about when we're talking about characters always getting to do their cool thing. But we can do that one later. We have superpowers. They can throw cars. They can bodyguard for other people. Cap can jump in the way of stuff, right? I mean, you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with power in the game. You can play these tactic cards that we talked about, right? And player choice is really important for that because we never want you to be able to do everything, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want you to be able to generate enough power with a character that you don't have to make choices, right? Like, that's not fun. If I get to play with all of my toys and don't have to make any choices about my toys, that's going to play out the same way every time I play the game, right? And we talked about variance earlier. We want to have variance in the game. We want it in dice rolls. We want it in what superpowers you use. We want it in what superpowers you use offensively. We want them in what you use defensively. We want it in what you use them for different crisis objectives. Some of the crises require you to pick up a token and bring it somewhere else to score points. Different characters are going to have different superpowers that are good at that. Some of the crises require you to hold a point and not die. Captain America is great at that. Shuri, not the best at standing on the front lines. So having characters have different ways to spend that power creates a lot of choice for the players, not only through how they build their rosters, but also how they act on the game itself too. So, and always giving you the choice as a player for what to do, right? We're not a huge fan of railroading things, which is a term meant like you only have one way that you can go, and that's what you're going to do, and that's it. Having you have the agency, have the idea for what you can do with it is always very important to us whenever we're designing characters. And then, of course, as the game continues and progresses, that will always be in our forefront in our mind for cards and Crisis.
Yeah, it is. And again, it is one of those things where, at the end of the day, the goal is that as you play this game, as you experience it with your opponent, you're telling that story and you're telling a unique story to yourself and you're making decisions and you feel like you own it. I think, going back to the railroading kind of thing, right? If the game just tells you, you do this, then you do this, then you do that, and you never make a decision, is it really your own? Does it become something that you hold on to, or does it become a meh experience where you're like, okay, well, that was fun, it was neat pushing the buttons when they told me to push the buttons, but it's not yours, and it's certainly not something that you're gonna write home about. You're not gonna talk about it later, And I think the amazing thing about really great tabletop games, and I think this applies to every game in some way or another, but because of that visceral, like face-to-face shared experience where we're across the table and we're in the moment. And I think this is another really big thing that we try to always do. And this goes back to that fast kinetic kind of environment that we talk about with alternating activations and stuff. We never want you to leave the moment, right?
Yeah.
But when we're in that becomes a thing that just imprints itself. It becomes a tale. It becomes a saga that we tell 6 months later, 12 months later, or even 4 years when we haven't seen each other. We come back, and you'll see this among tabletop players where, if you go like in the day when people could travel and you could go to conventions and stuff. And now we're doing this digitally, so we can have these experiences still, but in a different way. You'd remember those things. You'd have war stories effectively, and you would share those moments. And you would laugh about them, and they'd be just as visceral as before. And that's because you made something. And this is another really thing about hobby miniatures that's so, I think, amazing, and has really made me the convert, and had me want to do this forever. And a lot of the people I've talked to in the studio and stuff, it's the same thing, is that act of creation, and everything around it is a very powerful motivator. It's a very powerful thing to say, I've made this thing, I've assembled this miniature, I've painted this miniature, I've told these stories with this miniature, right? These are all my things. They're unique to me and the people that I've experienced them with. And that becomes a thing that you really can't replace in other spots, Anyone can anyone can ride the rails and get to the same destination. But when you blaze the trail, it's an entirely different experience. It's an entirely different ownership. And that's, of course, really important too. Going back now more to, like, we talked a little bit about clean rules and player experience and how that impacts, and having timing charts and stuff, right, as the thing that we think is important. This dovetails back into that idea of keeping you in the moment. So not only is gameplay and the speed and the pace at which we're trying to do things in Marvel Crisis Protocol designed to keep you in that moment so that the narrative is unbroken, the rules themselves are designed that way too. Clarity, conciseness, understandability, and being streamlined are all really important, because the last thing we want you to do is to stop in the middle of Hulk smashing somebody with a car to go check a chart, to go have to reference a different thing that pulls you out of the narrative, right? The game mechanics and the game rules can become part of that narrative as you learn how I'm doing these things. But if you have to go outside of the game, if you have to stop and mentally say, okay, well, we have to figure this out, or I don't know how this works. Once again, we have not succeeded at our mission, which is to allow you to have this shared experience in the moment, because the moment is what matters. And the second that you break that, you can't really get it back. And I think this drives a lot of what we do too when it comes to cognitive load, when it comes to all this stuff. We want to make sure that the players can stay continuously engaged and enjoy and relish the story that's happening on the tabletop, and not have to break away from that and then try to re-engage, because it's really hard to do that. Once that magic is gone, it's hard to get back. And so that also, I think, really dives into a lot of the things that we talked about in a larger scope of what we're trying to do when we're looking at rules, when we're looking at development, and how everything comes together to kind of make this experience.
Yeah, I think that's a great culmination of kind of everything that we've talked about. Is one of the most important things to us is keeping you in the game, right? And it's not like, what am I trying to say here? It's not like you can't look at your rules, right? That's not what we're talking about. It's more like, we don't want you to be confused about your rules, because if you have to read your card and see what it is, that's great, right? But we want you to be able to read the card and see what it is. So that does all sorts of things for that, I think, right?
Yeah.
For that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, and so I think the last thing, talking about kind of our design approach and the things that we did specifically for Crisis Protocol is, again, because there's a high level of investment in tabletop miniatures games, you are creating all of this stuff, not just games on the tabletop, but you're assembling, you're painting, you're creating this collection of Marvel characters that is truly your own. We want to value that and expand on that with not just the base game, but we also really took an extra step in terms of our design goals and approach. And we said, okay, we're going to build an engine that can allow a lot of different game modes. And I think you're seeing this more and more just overall in entertainment industries and stuff, right? People want to be able to experience the things they love in a lot of different ways. And so for us, it was really natural to just go in and say, okay, well, we have the 1v1, casual, where we're just going to play a game, we're going to have fun, we're going to tell a story. Naturally, because we're trying to make the rules really concise, really tight, so that you can enjoy that base experience of we're going to be in the moment, we're going to tell this awesome story, we're going to throw some buildings at each other, and we're going to have this crazy Marvel like narrative unfold on the tabletop that we're controlling, that we're actively writing through our choices and decisions. That can easily become a competitive thing. So you can, if you want to, go out and try to prove that you have the best tactics, that you can come out on top, that you can mitigate, you can be the best general, right? There are people who really like that, who thrive on it, who want to just experience that mode. They want to test their skills effectively against other people and just see, where can they improve, where can they not. And that's a fine way to do it. It's not the primary way that we expect you to enjoy the game, but it's a way that lots of people like to, and we want to make sure that it's accessible to that. But that's still within the base kind of general game rules. We've gone beyond that, right? We started and we said, okay, well, there are characters, and I think this is important too, because there are characters that when you're talking about this experience where we're going to take all these characters, we're going to throw them all together, and they all have their own series. She's crazy powerful. Like she does things that are just wild. And then you look at Captain Marvel in the Avengers comic run, where she's with a team, and the narrative is about this team working together to kind of bolster each other, to use each other's strengths and weaknesses. All of a sudden, that Captain Marvel is not quite the same, right? And it's narratively, it's important because she can't do everything. If she can, then why are the rest of the Avengers there? It's just silly. This game is about, it's an Avengers style story. It's about a group of superpowered characters coming together and combining to do something great. So you can't have, the end all be all of what they are in their solo series. But through these different game modes, we can kind of explore that. A really great example is Hulk, right?
Yeah.
The Hulk in the game, he can't be the Incredible Hulk as we all know him in the standalone Hulk series, where he's literally unstoppable. He beats up all of the Avengers. He is just devastation unleashed, right? Nobody can do anything to him because he's the star of the story. Everyone else is just an antagonist to him. He's more of the Avengers Hulk, where he has weaknesses. He has his role. He fits within the team to tell a great story. But if you make a different game experience where it is focused on Hulk being, the unstoppable, incredible Hulk that we all know from his solo comic line, and you build a game mode around that where maybe two players are trying to take on the Hulk, now all of a sudden you can do that. So you get to tell these different expressions of these characters within the bounds of the same game, and to me that's really exciting. And that was something that I know that you were really in love with because of your love of kind of the bigger raid modes in games, of the big bad bosses and the challenge those are to design. So talk a little bit about philosophy in terms of how you approach taking Marvel Crisis Protocol at its base form and then come up with a system where it is more raid focused, where you have players trying to overcome a super powerful character that's controlled by one individual.
Yeah. So as you said, these are much more narrative style scenarios. They use a different set of core rules in terms of like how activations work and things like that, but they still use the base game of Crisis Protocol, and that was super important to us designing these ultimate encounters. And the goal for them was always to sort of create an experience for players where it's not just like I sat down and I played a perfectly balanced game and we coin flipped and Hulk won this time, right? Like that was never the goal of Ultimate Encounters. The goal for these is always sort of to be like, well, what if Captain America and the Avengers teamed up with the Guardians of the Galaxy? Could they bring down Hulk? Well, maybe. Let's see what happens, right? Like, so when we were doing these ones, we were much less concerned about balance necessarily inside of them. We still, of course, wanted to create like a play experience that was enjoyable and people could have fun with, right? But like when we were playtesting them, it wasn't always about like, do we have a 50-50 win rate, right? Which it is for a lot of the other characters. But sort of the philosophy behind them was to create these very narrative, enjoyable experiences where you could do a lot of sort of what if situations. We have our Hulk one is hilarious. Honestly, you came up with a wonderful scenario here where Hulk is throwing people into gamma radiation things and all
Just
sorts of
my
great stuff.
love of professional wrestling and comics might have gotten merged together there. But, it's a thing. It
And then
works.
we have a Thanos themed one where Thanos has accumulated all of the Infinity Gems, and the heroes, the Crisis Team as they were called in these, is trying to their last ditch effort to stop him from doing whatever nefarious plan he has. And that one is a very high difficulty level. Thanos is obviously a very powerful enemy, um, and that one's not messing around. I guess that's kind of hard mode. I guess.
It's
And then we have
it's
our
certainly a
Ultron
different style of challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have our Ultron style one as well, which is sort of an intro into Ultimate Encounters. That one's about destroying a city and stuff like that and stopping Ultron. Um, we actually ended up making that one into an AI mode as well, so you can have no one play Ultron, um, and you can play Ultimate Encounters. But sort of the goal for them was always to create a new way to play the game and to create a new feeling for players to enjoy, I guess, that isn't necessarily a head to head, right? So
Yeah.
you could pull in someone that hasn't played before and they could play on a team with another person, or somebody wants to play a ridiculous Hulk that can pick up and throw people all the way across the map and stuff. Like, we can do that. We can give you that experience, and we can give you that feeling, that joy that you have from playing the fully gammaed, irradiated Hulk, right? And that's always really fun to me. I always enjoy the puzzle sort of trying to figure out how to beat these encounters after we make them, right? And enjoy talking with the playtesters with my friends and stuff. Like, oh, well, did you try this character? Did you try this thing? So it's I don't know. It's just a very refreshing and different thing than what's in a lot of other miniatures games. And I think it's very unique to what we've done.
Yeah, and again, the hope is right through these different experiences. We also do narrative asymmetrical scenarios through our organized play. We do it's how do you take all this great stuff and get the most fun out of it that you possibly can.
Yeah.
And that's always our goal, right? It goes back to that core thing, and this is why we kind of did this panel that we're now going to wrap up because we're at time. In the way that we did, because you start with your overarching goals. What are your pillars? What really defines what you want to do? And then you dive down. And that, if you stay true to those, if you, again, you show discipline and you stick to the course of what you believe is, right, and you don't let yourself veer off course too far, without really good reasons to, and I mean really, really good reasons to,
It's very hard.
You will find that you will have success, and that you will make things that hopefully bring excitement and joy and fun to people. And that's, at the end of the day, what we're really focused on doing. And I think honestly that's what anyone who gets into making games, in any capacity, whether like for a living or just as a hobby itself, is trying to do. They're trying to put a smile on people's face and bring them excitement and that shared communal experience. So hopefully this was enlightening and that you enjoyed our kind of after hours discussion on our approach to design and development. If you want to check us out, be sure to check out atomicmassgames.com. We have the Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures game, so if you love Marvel and you want to try a hand at hobbying, or you're already a hobbyist and you haven't checked it out yet, please do. We're very active on streams as well, so we're going to do several more panels over the week. Very hobby focused. This was our development panel, so be sure to check out the schedule as well. We appreciate all of you people from PAX checking us out and hanging with us at this late hour. We hope that you guys have a wonderful day, and we will see you on the next one. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye, y'all.